Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Governance, a Building Block for Power Sector Cybersecurity webinar. We have just a few housekeeping items for those of you who maybe this is your first time using Zoom. You will automatically be muted upon entry and throughout the course of the webinar. And if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to add during the webinar portion, please enter those in the chat box and we will have some time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. And we'll also open it up to a Q&A portion at the end. And so throughout the course of the webinar, if you have any technical issues, please send a message directly to me, which you can do in the chat box. You can either send a message to everyone or there's a drop-down menu where you can just send it to me, the host. And during the Q&A portion, just use your microphone icon to unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand or you can enter your questions in the chat box. Okay, and with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric Conde with USAID.
Thank you, Britton, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, I welcome you to this important webinar series on cybersecurity governance. This is part of the Power Sector Cybersecurity webinar series that USAID has jointly developed and designed with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, which is part of a broader effort for increasing energy resilience in Caribbean nations. This level of technical support is at the heart of USAID's Caribbean Energy Initiative, CEI as we call it, and this project, which was recently launched out of the Dominican Republic mission, aims to support Caribbean nations to advance energy sector reforms, enable economic benefits, and preserve the development of resilience in the face of natural disasters, extreme weather, and market shocks impacts. In particular, given the role that the electricity sector plays in daily welfare, advancing economic growth in the region, and post-disaster recovery, the CEI focuses on helping energy systems across the region to become more resilient. To reach its overarching goal, the CEI is working on the following areas: improving utility performance and reach, increasing competitiveness and transparency of energy markets, accelerating private investment into modern and renewable power systems, and disseminating best practices for resilience. I have to say that nowadays, and more than ever, it is critical that we understand and address the gaps and threats to our systems, either physical or virtual, cyber as we might call it now, and exacerbated with COVID-19. This includes reviewing past attacks to our networks, assessing potential impacts of cyber vulnerability of our systems, and learning what are our options to adapt and strengthen our system to overcome these challenges. Understanding how existing governance structures can contribute to advancing cybersecurity efforts is a critical component of today's effort. This webinar series that we start today is complemented with an extraordinary set of technical tools that are available to overcome these challenges. The one that we are presenting today is the Resilient Energy Platform. This platform is managed by NREL and provides experts resources, training materials, and tools to enhance power sector resilience. This by allowing and enabling decision makers to assess power sector vulnerabilities, identify resilient solutions, and make informed decisions to enhance power sector resilience at all scales. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I'm sure that we'll continue to collaborate to advance our organizational and regional goals for advancing resilience in our energy sectors, and I hope we continue to support you in this important work. I wish and I'm sure that we'll have a very productive exchanges today, given the level of expertise that we are bringing to the table. Thanks to all, and back to you, Britton.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. And now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Burton from CARELEC.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all panelists and attendees. Pleasant and warm good morning from the Caribbean. Carolec is very, very pleased to be part of this joint event. And if I may just take us back to about 4 years ago, Carolec was approaching its 30th anniversary in 2019, whereupon we embarked on a strategic planning exercise. And that exercise entailed a significant repositioning of the association, approaching its 30th year of existence, and resulted in a change and adjustment in our vision, in our mission, in our value propositions, in our governance structure, our organizational structure, and so on. And this was all in recognition of the changes that were occurring in the industry, in the sector, both regionally and internationally. And in particular, the phenomenon known as the 3Ds, which is decentralization, decarbonization, and digitalization. And in particular, the decarbonization and digitalization is really what underpins this collaborative effort with USAID and NREL, whereby Carolec recognizes both the opportunities and the threats that are posed with the new landscape and the emerging technologies. Indeed, our member utilities have not been immune to these threats, and thankfully have also seized on many of the opportunities for modernization of the grid infrastructure with the use of technology. One of the hallmarks of our strategic repositioning was the changing in our value propositions. And we have now espoused collaboration as our preeminent value, collaboration, followed by innovation and agility. And again, this collaboration brings us to strategic partnerships with the likes of USAID and NREL. We've also formed at the regional level strategic partnerships with the Caribbean Association of National Telecoms Operators and IT Providers, which is the sort of sister association to Carolec in the region, representing telecommunications providers and major information technology companies. And this strategic alliance also with CARICOM brings us into a close collaboration with the major players that we expect, again, that would assist in leveraging both the opportunities and combating and mitigating the threats in the cyber landscape. So it is my great pleasure to welcome the participants, the attendees to this webinar. I trust that our focus on governance as a building block, one of the 11 building blocks in the framework today, will be useful to all. And we look forward to ongoing collaboration with our valued partners, and trust that everyone today will have a pleasant sit-in. Regards again from Carolec and the Caribbean. Everyone keep safe and keep well. I thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Burton. So at this time, I would like to turn it over to our presenters, Maurice Martin and Tammy Reynolds, both here at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. Maurice Martin has 13 years of experience in technology research for the electric utility industry. And Maurice's focus is on impact analysis and experiment design, and he has extensive experience working with small and under-resourced utilities on their cybersecurity challenges. Tammy Reynolds has 6 years of cybersecurity research experience in the electric sector, and she's the technical lead on the Distributed Energy Resources Cybersecurity Framework, or DERCIF, and she also conducts cyber governance assessments in the electricity utility sector based on DOE's C2M2 and NIST cybersecurity framework. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Maurice Martin.
Thank you, Britton. Next slide, please. So our discussion today is about governance, but it's within the framework of the document that we call the Power Sector Cybersecurity Building Blocks, which is available on the Resilient Energy platform, and I'll give that URL in just a minute. But so I wanted to start kind of with the building blocks document and kind of explaining its origin and what the need that drove the creation of this document. Next slide, please. So we all know that utilities and all businesses, in fact, are facing a great deal of cyber threat these days. From ransomware, heard from utilities who have spent a lot of money recovering from those, and also just defending against ransomware attacks. More traditional attacks might involve deleting of data or exfiltrating of data, stealing credit card numbers or list of names and email addresses of your customers. And all that can result in loss of productivity and loss of confidence from either your customers or from other parties, such as investors. So those are common to all businesses, but particular to utilities, there is another concern, and that is cyber attackers influencing the behavior of devices that control equipment on the power level, varying voltages and current in a way that might be disruptive or even destructive. And those can lead to safety concerns. Those can lead to possibly outages where the lights get turned out for a certain amount of time, and or even in extreme cases, damage to equipment, either for instance, generation or transformers might be damaged. And those are items that are very difficult and expensive to replace. So there's a lot of concern around that. So utilities have a lot on their shoulders. And what we found from studying small utilities in the United States is that they often struggle to create a balanced cybersecurity program. What you often see in our past experience is that the cybersecurity program might be overbuilt in some areas. In other words, they're investing too much in certain cyber activities and underdeveloped in others, where they're not spending enough and leaving themselves vulnerable. Next slide, please. So our answer to that was to create the building blocks for the Power Sector Cybersecurity Building Blocks document. And the idea of the building blocks is borrowed from another USAID NREL product, building blocks for distributed generation, but applied to the cybersecurity domain. And what it does is break down the elements of a complete cybersecurity program, a well-rounded cybersecurity program, into 11 different building blocks, each representing a cluster of activities around a certain theme or idea, and kind of giving equal emphasis to those, so that it encourages thinking that is distributed around all 11 of the building blocks, and hopefully creates a well-rounded cybersecurity effort. For this project, we did not create any new best practices. This is all things that we reference from some of the best guides and standards in this space. And it's actually meant to address not only the utilities themselves, but other stakeholders. So you'll see some of the building blocks, which represent clusters of activities, are actually external to the utility. The report is there at the underneath the image of the report cover there, and also in the chat. I see James has posted that. Thank you, James. And the building blocks are not the last word on cybersecurity for utilities. We see everyone being on a journey of continuously improving cybersecurity. And no one ever gets to the place where they can say, I'm 100% cyber secure. But hopefully this will be, this building blocks document will be the right tool for some utilities at this stage in their cybersecurity maturity. Next slide, please. So here are the 11 cybersecurity building blocks, and the ones that are shaded solid blue are the ones they represent clusters of activities internal to the utility. Governance being at the top, and we'll be digging into that in just a second, but the ones on the outside are clusters of activities from other organizations, and I'll use cyber threat intelligence to illustrate that. That's information about what's going on in the larger world of cybersecurity. What devices are, or what vulnerabilities are being discovered for certain devices or operating systems, what bad actors are conducting campaigns against certain industries, things like that. And that's usually gathered by a place like the ISACs, which are industry-specific entities that gather information about cyber threat. There's one for the finance industry, aeronautics, and for the energy industry. Laws and regulations are generally a governmental function, and then workforce development can be a combination of a lot of different entities taking part of that. So as we talk about the building blocks, I'll be referencing this diagram and showing little pieces of it throughout. The arrows between the different building blocks show kind of categories of information that's passed between the different building blocks. And you'll see how this works as we go. Next slide, please. Each of the building blocks has its own internal structure, an introduction that kind of gives the concept behind the building block, why it's important, how it relates to the other building blocks. That's the intersections section. And then the processes in action, that's really describes the activities that you need to do to be successful in each of these building blocks. And then the essential data is kind of the information you need to be successful. What kind of data do you have to gather or acquire in order to effectively do these different tasks? And then there's, if you are interested in digging deeper into any of the topics covered in the building blocks, there's a references and resources section as well. Next slide, please. So cybersecurity governance, let's go to the next slide. How do we define that? One popular document is the National Institute for Standards and Technology Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure for Cybersecurity. And it describes the governance as the description given there, which actually covers a lot. And in creating the building blocks, we wanted to kind of tease out a specific part of governance. That is the part that is the responsibility of the leaders of the organization. And that would be the chief executive officer or executive director, the board of directors, anyone with that really high level leadership role and authority within a utility. Now I realize that we probably have a pretty diverse audience on this call. So we may have some CEOs, we may have some board members, but I imagine most the folks on this webinar are somewhere maybe in the middle of the organization, trying to set up a cybersecurity program. And so this hopefully will help you think about how to, what role your board or your leadership needs to be taking and how you can best engage with them to do that. And if you are a board member, this will also provide you with information on how, on your roles and responsibilities as well. Next slide, please. So these four building blocks, the topmost of the building blocks, are actually would all be covered in the NIST definition of governance, but we pull out from that, we kind of separate those out into four, and the governance building block are those activities that are specific to the leadership role in an organization. Next slide, please. And what those look like are, these are the unique activities for the leadership in terms of cybersecurity. They have to set the priorities. They have to do the monitoring of the cybersecurity program to make sure it's on course, and they have to allocate the resources, both human resources and financial resources, to make sure that the cybersecurity program. When I say it that way, it seems very simple, but there's actually a lot to it. And the important thing for everyone to remember, wherever you are in the organization, is that unless the top level of the organization is bought into your cybersecurity program, unless they really are committed to it, then you're going to struggle to achieve a reasonable level of cyber protection. And that the reason is that it's not only cybersecurity is not only a technical activity, but it's also a cultural activity. It's how people think and behave. And we'll dig in a little bit to what we call the culture of cybersecurity later in this presentation. But there's it needs to be, the leadership needs to be engaged and be informed. And so a lot of what you'll see here is focused on that idea. Next slide, please. So thinking about, and the next few slides, I'll just kind of walk through how that leadership role interacts with these other three building blocks, which are the main interactions. So one of the things that the governance building block provides to the risk management activities is that the utility leaders have to define the risk objectives and business requirements. Next slide, please. And what that means is that for business requirements, that's kind of like prioritizing what you want to achieve with your business. And if you think of all the things that a utility might have as their 2 or 3 year goal or their 5-year goal, it might be to lower customer rates. It might be to lower the amount of outages that you're experiencing. Switch to new generation sources. If you're an investor-owned utility, then you may be wanting to return more to your investors. And a lot of, when I show this to utilities, they often say, well, we want to do all these things. True, and those are all good goals. But for any utility at any one time, there's likely to be one that is given more weight than the other. And if you can identify that, then you can begin to think about the systems that are going to support your business objectives and build out your security to protect those critical assets. Risk objectives, the other side of the slide, is kind of defines your appetite for risk. And if you think about that, I'll use outages as an example. If you think there's a type of cyber attack that you might be vulnerable to, but at most that cyber attack can create an outage that lasts 1 hour, you might decide that you can live with that risk. That doesn't raise your concern level high enough to spend a lot to mitigate that. Whereas if you think that there's an attack that you might be vulnerable to that would cause you to cease delivery of power for a week or a month, that's a whole nother category of concern. So you might then invest more in preventing that. So kind of understanding what your risk appetite is, what you think your business can experience comfortably in terms of impact, also helps you define how your cybersecurity program is going to be structured. Next slide, please. And this is just a little bit of an aside. When we talk about cyber risk, what are we talking about? This is a popular definition of risk in the cyber domain, but by no means the only one. There are many definitions of risk. This is one, though, that I think really, in its simplicity, captures a lot. You think about the likelihood of a particular kind of attack, and then you kind of cross-reference that with the potential damage that could come from that attack. So you can almost, and this is often expressed in a quad chart, where you want to think about the attacks that are most likely and most impactful as being the ones that you really need to focus on. If something's unlikely, but it could have a high impact, but it's very unlikely, then maybe you can live with that risk. Or vice versa, if something's likely to happen, but it's only going to cause a small impact, maybe you can live with that. But this is a way of kind of sorting your thinking about risks and possible impacts, and having an internal discussion about that hopefully kind of not only builds consensus, but clarifies some of the issues for you internally. There is a different definition of risk elsewhere on the Resilient Energy Platform, but not too far from this one, I don't think. And like I said, there are many definitions of risk, and all of them are correct It's just the one that you find most useful. Next slide, please. So one of the things that the leadership does within the governance cluster of activities is kind of capture the decisions that they've made about cybersecurity, and those get recorded in an organizational security policy. And that's the main document that you need to have at your utility that defines what you're doing in cybersecurity. Next slide, please. The organizational security policy can also be called the master security policy. Captures those executive directives, and it should be a living document that is referenced by anyone in the organization. It should be available either in print form or in some kind of internal network format, so that anyone can go to it and use that as a reference. It's a good way for the leaders of the utility to keep track of what they've already decided, and if they need to update their decisions or their course of action, to revisit the document. It's also a good way for the technical staff who are tasked with implementing the cybersecurity plan to reference and kind of use as a guidance, so that if you get a question about why you're doing something or not doing something, you can go back to the organizational security policy, and it becomes the Bible for everyone's cybersecurity activities. The organizational security policy is sometimes one document, and sometimes it's kind of a cluster of document. It is sometimes useful to create smaller issue-specific policies around use of company equipment for personal uses, like can you take your laptop home? Can you answer personal email on your laptop? Things like that. Internet policies. Just having that kind of modular approach can be useful. And there are some really good templates and resources for those who want to create both large policies and small policies. Those are referenced in the building blocks document. So if you're looking to create or upgrade your policy, that's a good stop to make. Next slide, please. And then the compliance building block provides some very critical information to the governance and the leadership of the utility in the form of kind of a summary of all the applicable regulations. Next slide, please. So if you think about all the things that your organization may need to comply with, both cybersecurity regulations, if those are in play, but also regulations around personally identifiable information, laws about disclosing information after an attack. If cyber attackers steal your list of customers, are you required to inform those customers, and how are you required to do so? Credit card, there are regulations around credit cards and standards that have to be applied if you're going to use credit card systems. So compliance covers laws and regulations, and also standards. And standards are a little different. They don't have the same weight as a law or a regulation, but they're all often contain a lot of valuable information. Some are put together by international organizations like the International Standardization Organization. They can be something that is mandatory, as in whatever regulation you're subject to may reference a standard and say you must adhere to this standard, and then that becomes part of your regulatory requirement. It can also be voluntary. We know a lot of utilities who voluntarily choose to implement a standard because they perceive it to be good business practice, and we certainly think that's a great idea. And just to clarify, there are actually, the word standard is something that gets overused in the cybersecurity space. There's really three definitions. One is a standard referring to best practices, like the ISO 2700 series is focused on information security. That's a best practice standard. There are technical standards that define how technology works, like there's a standard by IEEE for Wi-Fi. If you are making a Wi-Fi enabled device, your device has to abide by that standard in order to interact with the other technology. And standard is also used to refer to internal policies within an organization. So all of these are correct. There's no wrong answer, but it's sometimes helpful to, when someone's talking about standards, get clarity on what kind of standards they have in mind. Next slide, please. So those are kind of the governance activities, the unique functions of the leadership role that are kind of covered in the or have touch points with the other building blocks shown on this slide. But there are others that are kind of unique and internal to the governance building block, the function. And I'm going to turn over the mic to my colleague, Tammy Reynolds, and have her speak about some of those activities. So Tammy?
Great, thank you, Maurice. Good day, everybody. Next slide, please. So creating a cybersecurity culture, why is this important? What does this mean? Helping inform the staff with things like don't click on the unknown email or don't go to the wrong website and click on anything that you shouldn't click on. What about Wi-Fi networks? What devices, are your devices being connected to Wi-Fi networks that might be compromised? And does the staff know not to connect to these? Don't pick up a USB drive in the parking lot and just automatically put it into one of your devices, thinking that maybe, that there might be something on there that might be useful, but ultimately ends up being dangerous. Using passwords like password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are not the best. Consider having 8 characters with at least 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, and 1 special character. And don't obviously allow sharing of other devices with other people, right? Does the staff know that we shouldn't be sharing devices? Next slide. So creating a culture can include things like presentations, newsletters, annual cybersecurity campaigns. Leading by example is super important, right? Walking the walk. Also creating incentives and celebrating success. Things like maybe, having a free lunch for everybody that didn't click on the email, or if you're having a phishing campaign. Things like if you provide cybersecurity awareness training for your staff, if everyone completes it by a specific date, having a celebration there, have a coffee hour or something like that. Provide regular training and have knowledge checks that everyone has to score at least an 80% or greater. And have this supported by the approved management, right? So having management on board and, also providing incentives to make sure that the staff is actually getting trained like you're wanting them to. Next slide. So assigning roles and responsibilities. Divide up the staff into groups of related activities. This will provide specific tasking to help ensure all things are being addressed as they might arise. Finding out who has the bandwidth to provide support with a certain activity, right? Making sure that they have the time that they need to be able to take on that task. Next slide. Next, we come to monitoring and progress of the cybersecurity program. So the bad news is no one is 100% cyber secure, right? That's what Maurice had just shared with us. But the good news is if you're always improving your game, you might just stay ahead of the bad guys. Unfortunately, none of those things can be put back on the shelf. It needs attention all the time. Evaluate where you are, set your goals, make your improvements, and then start back over, right? That feedback loop, and just continue on and on and on through evaluating, setting goals, and then making those improvements. Next slide. Okay, so metrics and indicators. Choose your indicators or examples. How many malicious emails were caught? How many events were investigated? How many staff needing training or needing retrained? Next, you want to measure and analyze, which will create a baseline so that you can then track over time and compare to the baseline. Next slide. So assessments, finding an assessment platform that fits your needs. Would this be, you know, a self-assessment or through a third party? You know, assessments, right, provide insight on areas that need immediate attention. They give executive management a key focus to where to invest time, money, and resources. And then obviously following up with reassessments allows for comparative analysis, right? Once you've taken a baseline assessment, you kind of, you know, you set that foundation and that initial metric. And then, you know, if you decide to do an assessment annually, then you'll be able to compare and see how well you've done over time. Next slide. Which brings us to a tool that we actually built out at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the Distributed Energy Resources Cybersecurity Framework, otherwise known as the DERCIF, is a cybersecurity assessment tool. Next slide, please. So this tool is basically composed of 3 different assessments. The first being governance, which is what our topic is today. How convenient, right? In this specific assessment was built off of the Department of Energy's Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, otherwise known as the C2M2, as well as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So in this governance assessment, you will find all the 10 domains, which are listed out here, right? Things like risk management, asset change and configuration management, and so on. Each one of those 10 domains has a list of controls, and this tool, this assessment tool, will guide you through this assessment process and allow you to interact with it. And it's a user-friendly tool that allows the organization, whether you're a utility or, you know, potentially, you know, a government entity that might have an energy system that you would like to, you know, assess the cybersecurity for, you would be able to go in and do a full governance assessment. And let me just clarify that the governance assessment doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have distributed energy resources, right? The next 2 assessments are more customized towards those types of devices. So the technical management assessment, as well as the physical security assessment, do have specific controls in them that address renewable energy. So things like in the technical management, we address things like account management, right? Authentication, authorization, and accounting. Configuration management, what type of change management do you have in place, what type of access control, and then systems device management specifically, right? Software integrity, cryptography, those types of things in that technical management assessment. And then physical security. We actually just did kind of an overhaul here and really looked towards DHS's model and pulled a lot of controls out of what they used and what they recommend for a good, robust physical security. And so these things are, right, like, you know, physical access controls, you know, what does your perimeter security look like? And we try to take into account, like, what does it need to look like for you, depending on what your needs are. Do you need, you know, fences and cameras and an armed guard, or, you know, or is your system not that vulnerable, and can you get away with just, you know, minimal security? So you're able to self-identify the types of risk that you might have, and then the assessment will then be customized for you in regards in that area. So next slide, please. So right, the DERSIF tool is unique from any other assessment tool because it specifically has those two assessments for technical management as well as physical security that have that focus on renewable energy assets. And then on the right-hand side here are just all the frameworks and documentation that we had pulled and done research on to grab and bring those controls into the tool to make sure that we had a comprehensive assessment tool that was absolutely addressing anything that had to do with distributed energy resources. And like I said, I'll just reiterate that the governance portion of the assessment tool accommodates all of governance for any organization within the electric sector, because it is specifically designed around the DOE C2M2. And I think I'll hand it back over to my colleague, Maurice. Thanks, Maurice.
Thank you, Tammy. Oh, I seem to be invisible today. And thank you, Tammy, for that look at some of the other functions of the within the governance building block. The remaining items within the building blocks are essential data, and I want to talk for a minute about that. The essential data is what you need to do the activities within a specific building block. And for the governance building block, this is kind of the information that you need. And it's not a complete list, but it captures the main things. You need that high-level information about the regulatory requirements. You need your information from outside of your organization about risks and vulnerabilities. You need to know what they call the threat landscape, or at least have some sense of it, so to know what is you're likely facing in terms of cyber threats. Obviously, you need your own budget information so that you can accurately kind of parse out what needs to what you need to spend money on, and what part of it needs to go to compliance versus other security activities, things like that. What resources do you have in the house that can help with your security effort? And that includes equipment, and as well as human resources. How well is your staff knowledgeable about cybersecurity? In terms of tools and technology, it's often the case that utilities have equipment or systems or applications that would be useful for cybersecurity, and for one reason or another are not using it. And there may be a reason for that, but it also may just be a bandwidth issue. So it's good to know what resources exist within your organization, and then from that you can decide what is the best fit in terms of meeting your cybersecurity needs. And then external resources. There are a lot of resources that exist. Sometimes government agencies can help the utility with their cybersecurity efforts. Sometimes there are international organizations that can provide aid or training. There's certainly a lot of information available at no cost or very low cost on the internet. You know, to the extent possible, become familiar with some of those resources. And of course, the USAID NREL partnership should be considered one of those external resources. We very much hope that we can work with you to meet your cybersecurity needs. Next slide, please. One thing under essential data that wasn't on the other slide is a list of critical assets. And this could be hardware, could be software, could be data. But whatever it is that is really needed by your organization to implement its cybersecurity program. And this list of critical assets is something that pops up in a lot of the building blocks, and it just speaks to the fact that having that list of critical critical assets is really important for formulating a lot of different parts of your cybersecurity program. So if you don't have that, it might be a good idea to begin to create a kind of an inventory of these very important systems, and who is in charge of them, who is in charge of maintaining them and updating them, what they do for your organization, the risks associated with loss of that asset, and even some information about whatever vendor, if it's a product of some sort, whatever vendor might have provided that, and ask yourself, if this vendor went out of business, how would that affect my business? And begin to think about having some kind of a contingency plan in case that might happen. Companies do go out of business. It happens all the time, and we've seen many cases where a certain data set or a certain application, or the function provided by an application becomes stranded due to lack of portability. Next slide, please. So just a few closing thoughts, and you can go to the next one as well. What we hear from a lot of utilities is that that they are concerned that does their board of directors or their leadership know about cybersecurity, know enough about cybersecurity to make the kind of informed decisions that need to be made. And that's natural, because their business is the business of the utility. They are not cybersecurity experts, but the good news is they don't have to be. There are some, a limited set of concepts around security and risk management that they need to know, but they don't need to get a PhD in cybersecurity, and that's good. And there are resources to help with that. The one highlighted here is from the National Association of Corporate Directors, and it's specifically for board members and to help them to address their cybersecurity oversight requirements. That book, getting that book requires a membership in the National Association of Corporate Directors, but there are others out there. There's some commercial training exercises that are available. EPRI has some resources in this field. And also USAID NREL partnership can help in that regard. We can give presentations to your board of directors on cybersecurity in general, or any topic in particular. We can facilitate discussions, and at the very least, we can help raise awareness. It's sometimes some utilities find it useful to have an outside party come in and address the leadership on certain topics. It kind of helps focus attention, and in a way that maybe having the internal folks does not. So we're happy to play that role if that's something you need and want us to do. Next slide, please. One thing you can do right away is get cybersecurity on the agenda of every board meeting or executive meeting. Make sure that it is discussed in some form or fashion. Get some metrics around how the cybersecurity program is going. How many malicious emails have been blocked each month or each quarter? How well are you defending against attacks or steering people away from malicious websites? Any kind of metrics are good. Reports on the threat landscape, what other utilities are seeing in terms of cyber attack, is also very good. Kind of gives perspective and context to the things that you're experiencing. Really, the content is not so important as just engaging the board on a regular basis, because the more they hear about this topic and become familiar with it and comfortable with it, the more they'll have a good idea of what they should be doing and what the organization needs in terms of leadership in cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So I've said several times that we're here to help. USAID NREL can help in other ways. Obviously, we're doing this webinar series, and we've got more webinars coming up on a variety of topics. We can do presentations, as I said, to your board of directors and also to other staff. We can talk to your non-technical staff about some of the cybersecurity best practices that Tammy mentioned. The cybersecurity is really a concern of everyone, and every member of the organization, whether they're part of the technical staff or not, has a role to play in forming the front line of defense by practicing good cyber hygiene and making sure that they're contributing and not leaving a door open for attackers. And that's both literal and metaphorical. You don't want, just as you don't want to leave the door to your office open, you don't want to leave cyber doors open that will enable attackers. We can also speak to your technical staff. We've already had inquiries about open source tools. Utilities wanting to know what open source tools are useful for network monitoring, for aggregating information from a number of different platforms that are monitoring cybersecurity, things like that. We've got folks who work at NREL on those with those tools every day, and we'd be happy to talk to your technical staff. And regulators, we've got some interest in from regulators about having conversations about how best to implement a regulatory program, what needs to go into it. We've got some experience there. We've also got some very good resources from USAID itself about how to correctly value regulations in terms of, you don't want to make them overly burdensome. You also don't want to make them too weak. So how do you right size your regulatory program? And happy to engage with you right at that. And I should pause myself and say that this kind of engagement is funded through the USAID NREL partnership. It's not something that you would, it's no cost to the utility to you. So we can certainly tackle any of those topics. We, as I said, just finished the building blocks document, looking for what else can we produce that would be useful to utilities. So please, if you have ideas along those lines, let us know. We'd be happy to write some more and get those on the Resilient Energy website. One-on-one technical assistance. We have gone into utilities and looked at the communication infrastructure for their substations and done an evaluation based on cybersecurity, what needs to be improved. We can certainly do that for your utility as well. Please let us know. And there are other types of technical assistance that helping set up SIEMs or network monitors, kind of looking over industrial control system or SCADA system security controls. If you have an idea about what you need in terms of technical assistance, just let us know. And then we're always looking for new tools that we can create to help utilities do a better job with their cybersecurity. One we're looking at right now, and it's kind of based on some other work that we're doing, has to do with cybersecurity return on investment. How do you right size your cybersecurity budget so that you're not overspending or underspending, and how do you describe the benefits that you get out of a cybersecurity program? It's always a little tricky because if you prevent an attack, then you have nothing to point to in terms of what the benefit of the investment was that prevented that attack. But there are ways to do it, and if you would like to see a tool that helps in that regard and makes a case for cybersecurity investment, please let us know. We'd be happy to kind of do a requirements analysis and find out just more about what it is you need and what you're looking for. Next slide, please. So again, here's the URL to the Power Sector Cybersecurity Building Block. The other webinars in this series will be based on other the building blocks. The next one is going to be specifically on cybersecurity awareness training, and that's the kind of training that supports the culture of cybersecurity, all those best practices for all employees that Tammy was talking about. This is often the activity that provides immediate return on investment, or fastest return on investment. Once you get people to practice good behavior, to not plug in removable flash drives that they, from random sources, or to use their work equipment in only appropriate ways, you see an immediate benefit in terms of less malware and less attacks coming through the system. So that's going to be in May, and then followed by all the other webinars listed there. We're hoping to add some to this list. And you'll be getting emails about that shortly, but we're hoping to have even more of this, and best case scenario, we get it up to a monthly presentation, which we think is a good rhythm. So hope to see you on future webinars, and I will open the floor for questions now. I'm going to turn off my camera because I don't seem to be appearing in the. I have no idea what's going on there, but.
Well, I saw that as well. I'm not sure. There you are. There you are. So I thought what we could do is we could open the polling to kick off our Q&A.
Great.
So I will go ahead and open that. So can everyone see the poll?
Yes, Britton.
Okay, very good. So if you could answer those questions, all of the attendees. The first question is, what type of organization or agency do you represent? And check all that apply. And the second question is, does the governance or board of your organization prioritize power sector cybersecurity in your opinion? And the third question is, which of the following power sector cybersecurity topics are you most interested in? And we'll give everyone a few moments just to complete that. So at this point, I'm going through and allowing each of the attendees to talk. So you can go ahead during our Q&A portion and unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon. Or you can always put your questions in the chat box. And it looks like about 68% of people have voted, so I'll give it just another moment here before we close the polling and open it up to Q&A. Okay, at this point, I'm going to end polling and share the results. So for the first question, what type of organization do you represent? It looks like the top Organizations are government and academia, followed by regulators and utilities, and then private sector and project developer. And then 9% are other. And for the second question, does the governance or board of your organization prioritize power sector cybersecurity in your opinion? 64% said they highly prioritize it, which is good, and 36% say somewhat. It's good to see no one said cybersecurity is not a priority. And then finally, for the third question, which of the following power sector cybersecurity topics are you most interested in? And it looks like equally weighted are governance, risk management, cyber threat intelligence, and laws and regulations, followed by technical controls, and it looks like incident response, and then compliance and workforce development. And lastly, organizational security policy. Okay, thank you, everyone. So at this point, I'd like to ask our panelists if you could to turn on your cameras. And if any of the attendees has a question, feel free to put it in the chat. And I will I'll read these questions that came in. Looks like the first question, how are the presented blocks framework different from DOE's C2M2? Maurice, would you want to take a stab at that question?
Sure. The building blocks document draws on a number of resources, including C2M2. The DERSIP tool that Tammy mentioned also incorporates some C2M2 ideas. We wanted something that was a little more of a, relative to C2M2, we wanted something that would be more help organizationally kind of structure your cybersecurity program. C2M2 is a very good document. It is kind of creates a way for you to monitor your progress and kind of score yourself on cybersecurity, but it doesn't kind of tell you how to move forward and structure your program. So that's kind of the difference, and as I mentioned, that's responding to a need that we saw in some of the utilities here in the United States, particularly small and under-resourced utilities. So C2M2, ideally, the way it works is you evaluate, and then periodically you evaluate again and monitor your progress, which is also very important. So we see them as kind of complementary, but our building blocks are hopefully filling a unique need that is previously unfilled.
Okay, thank you, Maurice. So it looks like the next question is from Brian. In 1999, I managed the Y2K response at Hanford, a major waste of time and resources. Are NREL et al. working on an intelligence plan towards cybersecurity, or just throwing untargeted resources at the issue?
Well, I'll take this one, Brian, because I've been in the workforce long enough to feel your pain. I was there for the big Y2K brouhaha. And all the nervousness around New Year's Eve. It sounds like your question is having to do with what the nature of the work that NREL does, and we think that our work certainly has value. the national labs, including NREL, are all working on some aspect of cybersecurity for energy delivery systems. The part we're working on is, or most focused on, is cybersecurity for distributed energy systems, distributed energy resources like solar. If you think about the way the grid is evolving and changing, it's moving from this kind of a centralized generation model to one where you have lots of much smaller generation facilities spread out over a larger area. And, you know, they need to be, their activities need to be coordinated to maintain grid stability. How do you do that? And how do you do that in a way that cyber attackers can't get in and turn those resources against grid stability? And so that's what we study a lot of different aspects of cybersecurity, but that's kind of our you know, one of our big focuses, and it's very forward-looking. So if you know, we're looking very much to the future. So trying to imagine the grid as it will be and what the vulnerabilities would be. So you know, like I said, we think this is an important issue because so many people are rethinking the grid and restructuring it. But whether or not it's you know, it's long-term value, time will tell. I'd certainly be interested in any feedback you have about the building blocks and the information we captured there. So please let me know, and we will take whatever feedback we get and think about future products and maybe future revision to the building blocks when that time comes.
Okay, thank you, Maurice. And it looks like Christine weighed in with an answer to Brian as well. Christine from USAID. Although incidents aren't widely publicized, the USAID NREL team has already heard about quite significant cyber incidents in the Caribbean region.
Good point, Christine. And we certainly hope that the work that we're doing will help mitigate future attacks. We also got a comment in the chat from Jamila, and wanted to reemphasize the point that the building blocks is a tool for to help kick off thinking in cybersecurity in a broad sense to all stakeholders. So hopefully everyone who has a stake in critical infrastructure, the utilities, the government agencies, the military, will all find value in this in terms of ideas about how to structure a well-balanced and complete cybersecurity program.
Okay, thank you. And Brian responding to Maurice. Thanks, Maurice. Good answers. Anyone involved in that debacle will recall the chaos in Department of Energy and the subsequent failure to take responsibility for the management of that non-issue. Not a question. Appreciate your response.
Well, thank you, Brian. And as I said, we all experienced that pain. We're old enough to remember the Y2K and the predicted stories of planes falling out of the sky and what happened.
Satellites falling out of the sky.
Satellites, yes. Satellites.
Okay, well, I will just give a last call for questions before we conclude. If anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the Q&A or the chat. And we will be following up with all attendees, and we'll be sending out some additional resources and a link to this webinar in case you'd like to watch it again. And also, I'd just like to let everyone know that the USAID NREL partnership sends out a quarterly newsletter, and we send out updates on upcoming webinars just like this one and trainings. So I will include a link to subscribe if you would like more information and you want to stay up to date on current information. And we also encourage you to head on over to the Resilient Energy Platform website for additional resources and information. And with that, we would like to conclude today's webinar and thank everyone for your time. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.